Good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. I'm Nicholas Richardson and this is the news. Fighters from the two groups that claimed responsibility for the Belgorod raid, the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion, said the Belgorod raid was just the first step and they would conduct more incursions into Russian territory in the near future. The Russian military said on Tuesday that it had routed militants who had attacked the Russian border region of Belgorod with armoured vehicles the previous day, killing more than 70 Ukrainian nationalists and pushing the remainder back into Ukraine. The fighters on Wednesday posed for a vast crowd of assembled reporters brandishing guns and holding the group's banners. Leaders of the group said the Belgorod raid was the first step and they would conduct more incursions into Russian territory in the near future. The groups were set up during Russia's full-scale invasion and attracted Russian volunteer fighters wanting to fight against their own country alongside Ukraine and to topple President Vladimir Putin. The two-day incursion from Ukraine into Russia's western borderlands around Belgorod took place far from the epicenter of the fighting in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region and around 100 miles from the front lines in the northern Kharkiv region. It could force the Kremlin to divert troops from front lines as Kiev prepares a major counteroffensive, according to military analysts. Though Kiev has denied any role, the biggest cross-border raid from Ukraine since Russia invaded 15 months ago was almost certainly coordinated with Ukraine's armed forces, as it prepares to attempt to recapture territory, analysts said. The incursion by militants into Belgorod strengthens Ukraine's hand ahead of a potential counteroffensive, a leading analyst has said, as it could force the Kremlin to divert troops from the front lines. Kiev is preparing a major counteroffensive it hopes will eventually defeat what it says is an unprovoked Russian war of conquest.
There are a number of different positive impacts for Ukraine's defense against Russia that come from this incursion into the Russian Federation. First of all, it shows that the Russian border is undefended, and this, of course, will cause Russia to divert troops away from the defensive lines elsewhere in Ukraine to try to reinforce that border, to try to prevent anything like this happening again. But also, of course, it's part of a pattern of events that show that Russia is not invincible. And Ukraine can, in fact, deliver damage to Russia itself. If we think back to, for example, the drone attacks on the Kremlin, exploding small explosive devices on top of one of the iconic buildings for Russian statehood, all of it undermines this narrative that the war will not touch Russia itself. We don't know, and we probably can't know, just what exactly is the relationship between all of the people who are carrying out actions within the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian armed forces or the Ukrainian state. Here, too, we've seen lots of different things which might be linked to Ukraine, which are neither confirmed nor denied by the Ukrainian authorities. But again, it fits part of a pattern that it is not just Ukraine that has an interest in undermining the Russian state and in countering Russia's campaign against Ukraine. Russia will inevitably portray this as being dangerous and escalatory, but that plays into the overall Russian narrative that anything that impedes Moscow or hampers Russia's war effort is going to inevitably cause severe escalation with the West. Now, that's been a highly successful Russian information campaign because it's constrained Western efforts to support Ukraine. And in fact, it's the reason why rules are put on the weapon systems that are supplied to Ukraine, with the West saying you cannot use these to strike into Russia. That is an enormous advantage for Russia in fighting this war because it forces Ukraine to fight with one hand tied behind its back. There's no overall template for the relationship between those and the Ukrainian state. Let's not forget that some Ukrainian armed formations, when the war first erupted in 2014, were set up on an ad hoc basis. And here, too, we've seen volunteer groups allying themselves with the Ukrainian defenses in sometimes a fairly ad hoc manner. So we don't know for certain precisely what is the relationship between some of these groups and Ukraine's official armed forces, and to what extent they are armed, aided, facilitated, or supported by Ukraine itself.
Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu promised on Wednesday that Moscow would respond to any more cross-border raids by Ukrainian militants swiftly and extremely harshly. Ukraine's government denied any role in the raid, which has been claimed by two anti-Kremlin armed groups made up of Russian nationals fighting for Kiev against their compatriots. They include far-right figures among their leadership. The Kremlin said on Wednesday that the use of Western-made military hardware by pro-Ukrainian fighters who conducted a raid on a Russian border region this week was consistent with the West's growing involvement in the Ukraine conflict. The Russian military said it had routed militants who attacked the Russian border region of Belgorod with armoured vehicles the previous day, killing more than 70 Ukrainian nationalists and pushing the remainder back into Ukraine. It is no secret for us that more and more equipment is being delivered to Ukraine's armed forces. It is no secret that this equipment is being used against our own military. And it is no secret for us that the direct and indirect involvement of Western countries in this conflict is growing by the day. We are drawing the appropriate conclusions. Images of some of the destroyed vehicles used by the pro-Ukrainian fighters broadcast on Russian state media showed US-made military hardware such as US Humvee vehicles. Ukraine will not be able to join NATO as long as the war continues. The Alliance's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said on Wednesday, "Everyone realises that to become a member in the middle of a war is not on the agenda, and that's not the issue. The issue is more what happens when the war ends," he said at an event organised by the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Brussels.
Everyone realized that to become a member in the midst of war is not on the agenda, and that's not the issue. The issue is more what happens when the war ends. Yeah. We all agree that NATO's door is open for new members, and that it is for the NATO allies and Ukraine to decide when they should join, not Moscow. They don't have a veto. And then we also agree that the most urgent and important task now is to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation. Because if Ukraine doesn't prevail, then there is no membership issue to discuss. But what we will do most likely is that we'll agree at least this program of making Ukraine even coming more closer to NATO and more interoperable with NATO.
If discussion of Ukraine's membership is not yet on the agenda, Stoltenberg said the alliance's next summit in Vilnius would focus on discussion on cooperation and on increasing the interoperability of weapons and systems between Ukraine and NATO. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky announced last September a bid for fast-track membership of the NATO military alliance and signed the NATO application papers in an online video. Before Russia sent its armed forces into Ukraine last February, Moscow was demanding legally binding guarantees that Ukraine would never be admitted to the US-led transatlantic defensive alliance. NATO forces have started major manoeuvres in Norway. The Norwegian military and NATO allies have been patrolling around offshore oil and gas platforms since the autumn, following explosions on the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea. The most spectacular part of the show so far is the participation of the biggest in the world, obviously a United States aircraft carrier, the United States ship Gerald R. Ford that sailed into the Norwegian fjords on Wednesday. The massive United States aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, sailed into Norway on Wednesday to hold NATO exercises with the Norwegian armed forces along the country's coast, the Norwegian military said. The ship is the world's largest aircraft carrier, and the exercises, due to start in the coming days, are a show of force of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization at a time of heightened tension between the military alliance made up of 31 countries from Europe and North America and Russia over the war in Ukraine. Norwegians lined up on the shore in Nesodden to watch the carrier sail past the Oslo fjord towards its mooring in Norway's capital, Oslo. Norwegian media reported that the USS Gerald R. Ford would sail north of the Arctic Circle. The Russian embassy in Oslo criticised the visit in a Facebook post saying, "There are no questions in the north that require a military solution, nor topics where outside intervention is needed." NATO member Norway shares a border with Russia in the Arctic and last year became Europe's largest gas supplier after a drop in Russian gas flows. The Norwegian military and NATO allies have been patrolling around offshore oil and gas platforms since the autumn, following explosions on the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea. That's the news. Thank you for watching. Stay with us for the weather, Poland Daily Business and more programmes. But from me, it's have a good night and a better tomorrow.